So welcome to this Govn365 webinar with Mike Bennetts on unlocking leadership potential. In terms of questions, just put them in the Q&A or chat. I'd better check that I've got that enabled so that people can do that. Let me just see, chat. Right, so it should be open to everyone. Put the testing on there so that everyone hopefully can see that. If you've got any questions, please feel free to add them on there. I will look at them every now and again, make sure that we address those. Before we get started, I just want to share what Govn365 does. So we work with owners, boards and executive teams to help you understand your blind spots and risks that could cause your organisation significant issues or loss of value. We then help you align on the best pathway to address those and support you in achieving that. As an example, I asked a group of directors and executives, how aligned are you on the strategic priorities? They all said they were very aligned. When I then asked them to share their top 3 strategic priorities, I got a lot more than 3. I think it was about 15. So we then help them align on those top 2 to 3 would add value for them. Another area that we help you understand is leadership within high performance governance. So we know from Dr. Dennis Mowbray's research on the 3rd team that when a board and executive team are strongly aligned, the organisation will perform a lot better. There's a lot of research around that. So we've got also quite excited to say that we've partnered with Weave Group. The Weave Group are a organisation that again looks to leadership. They've got a number of cohorts that they run, getting peer grouped together of executive leaders as well as up and coming leaders, where they have breakfast and then they get speakers in. Mike has been one of the speakers. I've been one of the speakers to help them develop their leadership. They also have a leadership course that they run over a year, where Mike's one of the people on that as well. Again, developing their leadership through building capability in a number of different areas. So Mike Bennetts is best known as a founding chief executive of Z Energy, having transitioned the company from its previous global owners in 2010. In 13 years at the helm of Z, Mike led significant corporate events like launching Z as a brand, an IPO, 3 billion of mergers and acquisition deals, debt and equity raises, and a takeover response, as well as receiving Deloitte CEO of the Year in 2016. Across his 2 decades of experience as CEO, Mike is known for his transformational leadership style and commitment to development of the people he works with and his purpose to realise individual and organisational potential. He's also an author, speaker, a mentor and a consultant, so a man of many talents. So welcome, Mike. Fantastic to have you on the webinar.
Kia ora, Gerry.
So in your book, Being Extraordinary by Confronting Your Ordinary, which I've read, it's a great book to read. I'd recommend it to people. You talk about generating context as critical to being able to move forward. When you think about your role as a CEO or on a board, and who are really busy, how have you integrated this into how you work in both of these roles, and what benefits have you found?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is there's people always have a context. It's what I'd call the default context. Before you even go to talk about strategy or restructuring or the new marketing program, whatever it might be that management and or board are working on, there's already a context that's already there for people. So if you want a set of outcomes or results that are different to what you've previously experienced, in many cases you have to displace that default context with what I would call a generated context. So in other words, one that's made up, not pie in the sky type stuff, but certainly one that you generate rather than just have that default be there. And that is literally getting everybody on the same page. If you do not have the same context, your thoughts, feelings, behaviors and actions will be different. Now, when I speak about this in my keynotes, I've got this, I think, quite a neat little set of cartoons that I show. And so, for example, there's 2 cartoon characters looking at a figure on the ground, and one of them is shouting, "It's a 6," and the other is shouting, "It's a 9." Now, it's actually the same thing, but they're viewing it from different perspectives. One of the other cartoons is a cartoon character jumping off an oil rig that's got flames on it saying, "Jump, it's burning." And the other character staying on the oil rig saying, "No, don't jump, it's only smoldering." So to me, there's the same thing is happening, or the same thing is being viewed, but the interpretation is different, and therefore the actions, in a very whimsical way through the cartoon, it clearly shows that your actions are entirely different. So I think there's always a default context. I think great leaders seek to understand what is there by default for everybody, including themselves. Then I think the really great leaders find some way to displace or disturb or replace that default context, which is one that is more compelling, that drives action in the sort of direction that you want to go.
So how do you do that when you come into an organization? What's the thing that you've done in the past? So, in terms of coming into Z, understanding that context where they were, what sort of things would you do?
Yeah, so when I was young and knew everything, I would go in and find fault with everything that was there. I would say, "Look, I know better, blah, blah, blah." That's how I used to do things. And then many years ago, I figured out that wouldn't work. So what I would typically do if I say came into a new job or into an entirely new organization, I would write down all the things that I thought were wrong, missing, different to what I expected, didn't understand. And what I found over time, and I changed jobs a lot in my career prior to joining Z, is that after about a month, most of the things I wrote down, I had drawn a line through because it made sense to me now. Part of that is the assumption that I think sometimes it's clearly the wrong assumption that sometimes CEOs or new bosses are brought in to fix things. Therefore, the boss relates to it like there's something wrong here. Therefore, they make these long lists of things that are wrong that they will fix. And what I realized is, by doing that a lot and realizing how wrong I was in my approach, is to write down the things that I saw that were missing, different, unexpected, and then it all made sense to me later on. Now, part of that making sense to me was I had to listen carefully to the different views of people, or be mindful of one of my expressions is when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So rather than relate to everything that was in the organization as being it's a nail I can hammer, is to understand it might be a nail, it might be a screw, it might be a staple, and therefore there's different responses required. So I think you've got to listen really, really carefully and be very, very prepared to give up your existing point of view, because the people that you are now leading are not stupid, they are not worthless, and perhaps the performance of the organization or the team isn't where it needs to be, but it may not necessarily be because of what they haven't been able to do or what they don't know and that you do know are able to do.
Have you had examples where you've come into an organization and through talking to various people, it might be the board, through your team, other stakeholders, you're getting a completely different, the 6 and the 9 and maybe 99 and 66 and are coming through from different people. So you're getting a completely different view, a non-aligned view coming through, and how you dealt with that.
Yeah, so that happens all of the time. And that's part of my challenge to myself and certainly to the folks on this podcast is to challenge yourself around, you will always find evidence for your point of view. Right. So and then you will ignore all of the evidence that's contrary to your point of view. So I actually like it when there is this diversity, even to the point of disagreement around it's a 6 versus a 9, because that actually helps you better understand that there is not a fully understood and mutually agreed context in this organization. That's why, as I said earlier, context is so important. And it's really, I think, critical to be able to listen to the views of those people and understand why they do what they do. There's a psychologist who was a heavyweight, alongside Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, over 100 years ago. They were three Austrian globally renowned psychologists. And one of his phrases that I love is as human beings, we subjectively interpret the object of reality. Right, so what that means is even though the same thing has happened, we each interpret it in different ways. So I think by being open to those different interpretations helps you with two things. One is there is no one right answer. That becomes pretty clear, 6 versus 9 or 66 versus 99. And you will need to do something to displace the context for people before you start to implement whatever change it is that you want to do. Otherwise, the 6s will go, great, there's a change that's good for 6s, and those that see the world as a 9 will be consciously or unconsciously resistant to the change that you want. So I'm still surprised and not surprised at the same time that business leaders don't truly appreciate the context from which people think, act, feel, and behave before they get after implementing change. If you don't change the context, there will be no change in behavior, thought, and action.
And how do you start to change that context? What's the things that you've done in the past?
Yeah, so you have to describe it. You have to tell a story around it. So in a simple sense, when I talk with particularly boards around this one, I show them a graph. It's what I call the K graph. So it's got the x-axis is time and the y-axis is organizational outcomes. And what I say is that we need to agree on what's the current context. We need to understand what's predictable for this company. And usually that's a line that degrades from the current context. It goes down over time. And so therefore, what's predictable if we just continue to tolerate existing gaps, trend out current or extrapolate out current trends, etc. Where do we end up organizationally? And then as in a contrast to that, what's the generated future? So current context, predictable future, and generated future. And for me, unless you are fully understanding and mutually agreeing those three contextual horizons, you're in trouble, because strategy, organizational development, any change programs you implement is the way you close the gap between what's predictable and that generated future. Strategy is not a thing necessarily in itself. And this is why I have huge empathy for people who say, oh, we as directors or we as management keep relitigating strategy. It's because they did not have an agreed or fully understood and mutually agreed context at the time. And that context keeps coming back when they find that the strategy is either not working as well as you thought, or there's execution challenges, or a pivot may be required. The context sets the tone for that. If you think the platform is burning, you will jump. If you think it's only smoldering, you will not risk your life by jumping off the platform. Now, the platform, the action, jumping or staying, is the equivalent of strategy, but it's all so informed by the context. If you think you're going broke, or if you think that continuing what you're doing will lead you to go broke, you'll be much more energetic around what you need to do to interrupt or displace that or change that trajectory than if you think, oh, things are okay. They're not as great as they could be, but they're kind of okay.
Yeah. And I've seen companies that sometimes get the current context right. They struggle probably with the generated future scenario. So, and again, is that you coming in with, based on all you've heard, listening to the various stakeholders and putting a stake in the sand, or is that a collaborative process you work with your team and the board, or any of those in between?
Yes, so it could be a bit of both. So in my role as an executive, I would do that with my team, if you like, and then we talk to the board about it. I'm actually having some quite interesting experiences now where, in a couple of cases, boards have brought me in to understand that. And so all I do is interview the directors, and I ask them a series of questions around current context, what's predictable, and what's the future they want to stand for. And I play that back to them, not as an author, but as an editor. I say, look, these are just my words that I've packaged together. And it's very similar to your opening comments at the head of this podcast, that strategic priorities, we're all on the same page until we actually have to discuss what they are. Then we suddenly realize we've got 25 strategic priorities. So the penny is really dropping for the people that I work with as a coach and consultant around, one, how important context is, and I take them through a primer on that so they can sort of understand why that really matters, both psychologically and from a business perspective. And then when you actually document it, I've often find people have a reaction, particularly to what I document as the predictable future. But when I say, I understand that you find that upsetting or disturbing, but is there anything in there that you disagree with? Or what is not fully understood and mutually agreed? And usually they go, actually, I might have worded it differently, but you're kind of rubbing our nose in it. So that's why I think it's so important. And even something simple, when someone goes into something that they may relate to as particularly challenging right now, as a coach, one of the questions I put to them is, so what's predictable here? So if Mike does Mike, Gerry does Gerry, the team does the team, what could you reasonably predict as the outcome here? And is that really what you want? Because so many of us, we're challenged by something, we jump into it, we want to be seen as a person of action. And before you know it, Gerry, Gerry, Mike, Mike, team, you go like, wow, that didn't turn out the way we thought. and that was entirely predictable.
Yeah. And leading on from that is around the human dynamics of boards and executive teams. And one of the areas, you've probably seen in your coaching and I see in my coaching is people having difficult conversations, or you say that there's no difficult conversation, it's about the framing. So it's having the right conversation at the right time. And you call them in your book conversations that matter, because obviously if you don't have them, there's some implications. And many people shy away. So I'm interested, you also mentioned the unsaid, the things that go on in our mind that we don't discuss, but sometimes should discuss. What do you see as the biggest barriers to having better conversations in teams, and what can the leader do to encourage that and make it safe?
Yeah, I think that like a really simple thing is to get rid of adjectives. Like we say, I've got to have a difficult conversation with Gerry. Well, no, you need to have a conversation with Gerry. And I think we use these adjectives, and that just kicks off almost a reptilian response in our brains, like, who the hell wants to go and have a difficult conversation? Versus if you said, I need to have a conversation with Gerry about how we can improve his performance, entirely different relationship to that. So I do think words really, really matter. And that's why, if anything, I say to folks, don't completely stop using adjectives, but be way more mindful about how you use adjectives. If you're describing a conversation, be much more focused on the outcome from the conversation rather than what you think it's going to be like. Because usually what it's going to be like is difficult, challenging, awful, or we tend to use those words, versus the outcome is a clear action plan on improving Gerry's performance. And then come back to how you started. I think the unsaid, my favorite quote on that is one of my own, which is the unsaid is never spoken but clearly communicated. So what I mean by that is we might think I'm not saying how I'm annoyed with somebody, or I'm not saying that I'm not really committed to that particular activity, but it does come through when you may not hear it audibly, but when sometimes we call it our gut, or my sense is. So I do think the unsaid is never spoken but clearly communicated. And I think great leaders are always looking for the unsaid because it is communicated, or great leaders are finding ways for the not spoken but communicated unsaid to be spoken. So Gerry, when you think about what we're about to embark upon, what's on your mind about that? What concerns would you have? Where do you think that would be particularly challenging for us to work on together? So create as you say, a psychologically safe environment for that to be expressed and then dealt with, rather than unsaid and never dealt with. And two other fundamental spoken conversations that I think are often missed in organizations is one is what I call completion. So the purpose of a completion conversation is to say everything that needs to be said and have it heard, such that your past no longer inhibits, constrains, pollutes your present or your future. So another way of saying that, almost psychologically, is get closure on what's happened. And it's not to say ignore the past or make everything that happened in the past good. It's just have the past be in the past in such a way it doesn't impact your present or your future. And I think performance reviews are a good example of that, where we often relate to them like a functional thing. I have to assess Gerry's performance and tell him how well he did and where he needs to improve. But it's also getting complete on the year, because the last thing you want to have as a leader is if there's things that are incomplete between the two of us from the last financial year, you don't want that to pollute what we're currently committing to or what we're going to get to work on. So I think completion is really, really important. And then the other one I think is what I call fundamental connection. And this is not about having conversations with people to be best buddies or understand their weekends, etc. But it's to understand what is the mutual commitment you both have, or in the matter of this project, what is it that you're committed to? And you're discussing that, exploring that, and then agreeing that. And so what I say is, in the absence of completion and in the absence of a fundamental connection, you will never, ever get to the realms of high performance, because you'll be stuck on action, which is clearly needed for high performance, but there'll be incompletions that pollute those actions. And if you're not fundamentally connected to the same things, the actions will start to be divergent. And part of fundamental connection is being clear on what's the context. So given we agree this context, what can you and I commit to in terms of getting that project delivered or that particular program of work complete.
Have you ever come into a team where it was dysfunctional or people were blaming each other, and you have a psychologically unsafe arena, I suppose? How do you go about addressing that? Is it through building trust and getting to know each other, or are there some other more fundamental things that you've got to go through to build that trust?
Yeah, I've certainly had more than one experience of that. And the things you just pointed to, I think, are important. Where I start from is I take 100% accountability for the situation that's there. So again, I think as leaders, it's really easy to come in and say, and I had a situation where, I used to work for BP, and in those days, the business unit performance around the globe was ranked, from top to bottom. And so I was brought in as the number 2 into a business unit that was ranked 42 out of 45, right? So pretty poor, and that was, a challenging team, etc. So rather than walk in there and say that these guys are really, really bad and I'm here to fix it, I said, okay, well, I am now 100% responsible or accountable for the situation we're in, even though I was not in the past that got us to this point. And so what I focused on was just being really authentic about, where I am, how I think about things with people, being really, really straight with people about things, about how I viewed it at this point in time. I would talk about what I was committed to, and I would talk about how I see the context, again, trying to disturb the default. So an example of this was, and this is when I was in South Africa, I think my second week, I'd flown up to Joburg, and this business unit had been restructuring for over a year. It just hadn't kind of done that well. And Johannesburg was at that time was a relatively antagonistic environment, and I was the head office was in Cape Town. So I flew on in, first session in front of people, had a big town hall, like 100 people in the room. And someone put their hand up and said to me, Mike, will there be redundancies? Right, obvious question to ask. Now, at that point in time, I did not know, but I was really straight. I said something like, actually, I don't know the answer to that, but the answer is there probably will be. Right here, right now, I don't know how many and where that will take place, because I'm still trying to understand what has to be done and what has not been done so well from the past. But what I'm committed to is blah, 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 blah. Now, what I didn't realize at the time, and I got some feedback a couple of months later from people, they said that was the first time any of the bosses had acknowledged that there was likely to be an impact on people, that was honest to say, right now, I don't know, and actually committed to something, and committed to something other than I'm going to do everything I can to maximize my bonus for the next year. It was actually committed around what was best for the business. Now, to me, that was like a perfect example of me being responsible for the situation versus, it seems clearly previous management have not done a good job here, so I'm really, really sorry about that, which at one level you might think you're being empathetic, but all you're doing really is blaming someone else and kind of like showing up, because I'm sure they said the same thing about their predecessors. So I think that to me is like being authentic, being straight with people, being committed and sharing what you're committed to, and starting to generate a context within which you'll get thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and actions consistent with what you're committed to. And that requires a lot of listening.
Yeah. And when you come into a new team, one of the things I think I read from your book is getting a sense of people, getting an understanding of them. And there may be some people that, may not be with the organization. You may have to have some conversations with them. But how do you get a sense of people quite quickly in roles that you've come into? So that example of South Africa, you've got an underperforming organization. What's your process that you go through with the team?
Yeah, I think you just answer you ask and answer 3 simple questions. Why are you here? Or why do you choose to stay here? What matters to you? And what concerns do you have right now? There's a guy called Oscar Trimboli who's like a world-class expert on listening, and one of the things he says is great listeners change the way how people speak. So those are pretty profound questions. So if I listen from the perspective of I'm trying to catch you out, trying to make you wrong, I'm trying to find evidence for why I should fire you, versus I genuinely want to understand, what's on the go for you. I really want to appreciate what's important to you, so I can kind of like consider that. Just that orientation around listening is likely to create a psychologically unsafe or psychologically safe environment within which people can express that. So it's pretty simple, like, why are you here? What about being here matters to you? And what's concerning you right now? And the other thing that I do usually when I'm in a role, so the time I've employed like GMs to report to me, I've had myself psychologically assessed, the sort of classic stuff you do as part of recruitment, and we obviously use tools like that when we recruit people. I would get their report, which was a consideration for me in appointing them to the job, and I would obviously debrief that with the organizational psychologist we used at the time, and then you'd make the job offer. Then I would go back to her and I would say, given how you understand me and how you understand them, where will we get on like a house on fire? And where will we have understandable challenges, and we have to work very carefully and mindfully with one another. So in other words, using the data. So rather than take 12 months to figure out how we best work together, you've already got enough data to figure out the easier pathway and the more challenging pathway. And I would sit with each of my direct reports and say, okay, well, here's mine. I've already seen yours. The psychologist says we're going to get on well here and find that challenging. How should we work our way through that? So I think there's quite a lot of tools that are available for people. So rather than take 12 months to figure it out, like, ask those 3 simple questions and grab some data and make that the focus of your first week or two. And you get off to, you don't have to take 12 months worth of getting it right and wrong to figure out how to make it all work.
Yeah. So how did it play out in South Africa? So you obviously opened with that. What did you do next with the team, and how did it play out?
Well, I think it's probably important to talk about what was the result. A year later, I think we were ranked number 16 or number 12 out of 45.
Right.
All right. So you can say the result was that. Now, that's not because, look how clever I was. That was because, as part of a team, a leadership team, and then ultimately the whole organization, frankly, we got our shit together on stuff that hadn't been done so well in the past, that we did some of the basics that I spoke about. Now, I did that in 1999, so a long time ago. So my thoughts and evolution of how I approach these things has improved since then. But it's just like some basic stuff. The group, people weren't clear on why we were doing it. Well, not in a way that was compelling for people. It was more like, we're bad, we're wrong, we're not making enough money, costs are too high, all that sort of stuff. So that the people were reasonably tuned into what was predictable, but not in a way that caused action. And there was no generated future. It was like, fix what's broken versus this is where we want to be. And there's some amazing achievements by the team over that 12-month period, because context was clear, commitment was evident. We spent a lot of money, I think, relatively a lot of money on people's development. This authenticity, straight speaking, I just think that helped. If you find yourself as a leader speaking in a version of corporate bingo, the corporate buzzwords, you kind of have to think about, am I really getting my message across? And maybe you are, right? But maybe you're not. I think there's, people listen from different perspectives. If I want to put it in a model, there's kind of 4 different types of thinkers. And you need to be able to speak when you're doing big comms, particularly around change, to each of those things. Those quadrants, if you like. Otherwise, you might speak to the ones that are just like you, in which case you probably nail 25% of the audience, but you leave 75% saying, I just don't get it.
Yeah. And in terms of development, you talked about focusing on development. How do you approach developing people in your team? So there's various different methods that people use, having a separate development plan, separate objectives. What's something that's worked for you that's applicable to any company that you go into?
Yeah, I actually think having a, if you like, separate or focused development plan is a good thing, rather than perhaps embed it in a performance review. Certainly in my time at Z, we realized the power of making that optional for people. Like, as leadership, we had a strong preference that people would complete that. But rather than try to drive 100% compliance, which tended to drive the quality down, we said, look, here's all the tools, here's everything that's available, and at least once a year, we encourage you to go through this process, complete the template, and agree it with your line manager. So I actually like the idea of having a plan. I much prefer the idea of actually having some goals or outcomes you want to achieve for which you have a plan for, rather than just plan to do a whole bunch of stuff. And I think it does need to be focused on the things that frankly matter to the person. Organizationally, you might say, I want you to work on your marketing skills. And this person says that I want to work on something else. So I think you have to, talk and listen to one another carefully to find the right match. But if somebody's working on something that doesn't matter to them, they just won't do a good job. So I think being a leader is to say, okay, I've got to find the match between what's best for the organization and best for the individual, but know that the individual will always act in their own best interests.
And there's a couple of schools of thoughts in terms of focusing on a development need or a gap versus focusing on a strength and strengthening a strength. So what's your view on that?
Either or. I think I can see the merits of both. I tend to be much more situational. There's certain things like, I don't know, say health and safety, where to me there's a lot of black and white in a realm like that. But in terms of someone's development, being stronger at something, at an existing strength, is a good thing, or closing out a gap. It's all situational to actually what's the outcome that you want. If you want to have a job like mine as a CEO, building on a whole bunch of strengths and still having these big gaps is frankly not going to get you there.
Yeah.
But equally, you shouldn't just work on the gaps and not have some, and so that you're a great all-rounder in a way that you're average, for want of a better expression. You will need to have some strengths or some spikes in certain areas that are more critical to the job. And that's why I think sometimes you just don't replace a CEO with the same sort of CEO. The company may require something different, so they want to put more emphasis on perhaps distribution, production type skills and experiences rather than marketing, or a stronger corporate background or a stronger finance background. To me, it's all situational. It's like, what's the gap we're trying to close and why? And what's the best way to get there? Building strengths on strengths, or closing out some areas for improvement.
Yeah. And switching to your role, because you're on boards as well as executive teams. How different or the same is it in terms of building a high performance governance group versus building a high performance executive team? Because obviously, executive team, you're with them every day, day in, day out. A board, you might be with them, for a day every couple of months.
Yeah.
So some different context.
Yeah, so I think that's really, really challenging. And I'm personally much clearer on how to create high-performing executive teams than I am high-performing boards, because I just have more relevant experience in the executive space. I'm not and never have I been a full-time director. But I think some of the fundamentals are still there, Gerry. Let's all get on the same page with context. Let's work on making sure we listen well to one another. Let's understand and appreciate the benefits that come from diversity. Let's understand what we're all mutually committed to, which aren't necessarily the company's targets, but actually as a board, what are we committed to as a board and how we work together? I do believe that there is a requirement for socializing. I think as directors are part-timers, they sort of drop in and out. I think, that's sort of the archetypal board dinner, I actually think is a really good thing. When it's actually enabling people to further their relationships with one another, I think it's a good thing, versus have the board meeting the night before with the CEO and then the next day is just routine. It's not that sort of board dinner that I would talk about.
Yeah. So you're talking about I suppose, building trust, building psychological safety in that group through getting to know people. Yeah.
So the example I'd give is that let me think about how I'd word it. So often we can relate to people as what they are. Right? People might say to me, "Oh, Mike, you're the chair of that company. You've got this experience." There's a whole bunch of things that they would relate to me as. But I think the real juice for high performance comes from if they could relate to me like what I'm committed to, right? What I call why I am versus what I am, then that opens up a whole lot more opportunities, because they frankly could get distracted by what I am. Like, you don't have enough experience, in my case, in venture capital, Mike. So how can you really run a venture capital fund? Versus actually, I'm committed to the democratization of venture capital in New Zealand. That kind of opens up more than, Mike doesn't know enough about VC or the ecosystem. So I always challenge people to think about how could you relate to someone as their commitment, rather than how they behave or what they might do with you, because I
Mm.
find how they behave could be somewhat inconsistent with what they're committed to, and you can get distracted by how they behave. So I'll give you an example. Yeah, when Z got bought by Ampol, I clearly had a new boss, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of going, this is a terrible situation. I've got to work for another boss. I don't really know him. They're going to come and take over New Zealand, destroy us. All the stories that you tell during change. Instead, I asked Matt to talk about what he was committed to, and he made 4 commitments. And before I met him, every time and we did it like this, I would read what his commitments were. So the top of my mind going into that meeting was, I know that Matt is this, as opposed to Matt is doing that, or Matt is trying to do that, or Matt is making my life a nightmare by not doing that. I just found that incredibly useful all of the time, but particularly in a situation like that where you can tend to default to a whole bunch of stories you make up about what's happening. So relating to someone as what they're committed to rather than what they're doing just frees you up on a whole bunch of things. I like to talk to Matt in a really different way, knowing what he was committed to versus being distracted by, I think that's what he's really trying to do when he says that.
Yeah. When you say committed to, is that committed to in the business sense? Because you also talked about relating to my why, which talks more to values
Yeah.
versus the company. So and I know you've done some work with Michael Henderson, who I've had on here. I'm interested in that values piece and how you uncover that in the team and yeah.
So I think it can be both. In this particular case with Matt, he had expressed his commitment as expectations, right? So he said, "I expect this of you," and he made it of me, of Z, and actually I shared it with the whole company, so that people were really clear about what Matt expected. And it was things like, and I can't quite remember the words, that I expect you to raise concerns when it looks like we're compromising the essence of Z. Right. Now, that's not quite the words he used, but that's how I remember the intent of that particular one. But that's really freeing, right? So rather than go into a call with Matt thinking I've got to now take him on about this thing because it looks like they're trying to screw us on that, all the stories you make up. I say, actually, Matt expects me, and Matt is committed to that expectation that I will raise concerns that look to compromise the essence of Z. That's incredibly empowering. Versus I've got to take on my new boss and tell him that I don't think he's doing a good job. So just change the whole frame. When it comes to things like values, again, if I think about what we did at Z, we'd have an annual offsite as an executive team. The only time we went offsite was once a year, and we had a conversation, we had conversations around completion and fundamental connection. And so we'd ask people the question like, why are you here, and why do you still choose to be here? What about being here matters to you? Now, in some cases, I heard that 12 or 13 times from somebody, but each year it was slightly different on the year before, and it opened up something for me about how we work together. Or put another way, it enabled me to kind of call them out on their own BS when I think you're just playing small because you told me that mattered to you, and that's why you're here. And I'm just seeing a gap between that and kind of how you're showing up right now, as opposed to saying you're doing a bad job.
Yeah.
And you imagine how we spent half a day on that. So incredibly expensive. 10 people spending half a day on why are you here? Why do you still choose to stay here? What about being here matters to you? But I tell you what, you're incredibly grounded as a team when you have that conversation. And we were off-site, so it wasn't jammed into a meeting room in between emails. It was, in a nice rural setting. So it was more conducive to that. So we created the environment and the space to have a thorough conversation around that. Yeah, and as you expect, there were times where it was emotional for everybody, and so those emotions sometimes showed up in different ways. Sometimes tears, sometimes upset, sometimes for people confronting things about themselves or being confronted by what their colleagues are saying. That's incredibly great for building strong relationships with one another. And it was not perfect, by the way, so I don't want to come across as saying that's the answer to everything, but it certainly pushed us further down the line, I think, towards high performance or the possibility of high performance than not having those conversations.
Yeah. I just realized I saw a hand up, but I don't know whether the chat was enabled. I've tried it again now. It looks like everyone can add a question. So I think there was someone who had their hand up. maybe to do with the chat. Give it a go now if you've got any questions. Just in terms of building high performance teams. So you've talked about a number of the context setting, some of those conversations. Is there anything else you do to ensure that you're building a high performance team, and how do you know that it's a high performance team? What tells you that? What signals you get?
Yeah, a fundamental on that is what I'd call integrity. Now, when we use that word, actually it has two meanings. There's integrity from the perspective of morals and judgment aspect of integrity. And for the engineers on the call, they'll understand that there's another thing around integrity, which is something, is whole and undivided and works as designed. Like, a pipe or a tank, or like the swimming pool, it has integrity or not, right? It either has a hole in it, in which case it doesn't have integrity and it doesn't work as designed. And what I would call workability goes down. So what happens when it comes to things like swimming pools and pipes and tanks, bridges, etc., we have really defined standards on what integrity means. There are quality standards, there are ANZ standards, there are regulations that apply. But when it comes to the integrity around people as opposed to things, we actually don't have a standard. Now, I have one that I work to, and that I think this is at the fundamental part of high performance. So integrity is, as it relates to leadership, if you like, is keeping your word or doing what you say you will do. It's doing what is expected of you. It's being true to your values and what matters to you. And anytime you're out of integrity, you do something about that immediately. So in addition to what I've spoken about, integrity is a massive focus for me in terms of high performance. So not in the sense of, the team or I as a person don't have integrity from a values, moral judgment perspective, but from the simple perspective of, do I keep my word? Do I do what's expected of me? Am I true to my values? And do I tidy it up anytime I'm out of integrity? If you got that right, you would have a massive, massive increase in performance. And you get the whole seminar.
In your word, doing what you're saying you're going to do.
Yep.
Your commitment, true to your values.
Do what's expected of you.
What's expected of you.
Your values or what matters to you. And anytime you're out of integrity, tidy it up.
Yeah. Okay. Got a question here. You mentioned assessment tools to understand alignment or gaps between hiring manager and appointee. Which assessment tools have you used or do you use?
I honestly cannot remember. A plethora of them over the years. I'd say that whatever tool I'd use, I'd want to use it in a way or have a tool that enabled you to be clear on where you want to get to. So what's the outcome that you want, and work your way back from there. I think, tools that say you're good at this, you're not so good at that, they're useful, but relative to what? Right. So Gerry, you talked earlier about building on strengths. Well, that might be great, but if that's not leading you towards the outcome that you want, then it may be superfluous action. So
are they a supplementary, or are they a something that is critical to the decision?
In what sense?
So in terms of you obviously go through an interview process. Is the the assessment going to cause you to not take someone on because it's so out of alignment, or if it's within the bounds of the averages, you say it's not going to make a difference. It's only if it's at the outliers. Is that the only time you would?
Yeah. There's no such thing as the perfect candidate. We're all a wonderful mixture of all sorts of things. So we will use, like, for example, one would be the Hogan behavioral assessment. I think is a pretty well known and used tool. There's no right answer for that. It just tells you, how this. Sorry, I do that because that's how the report comes out. How the person would waver between something like being compliant and being a rule breaker. That's not the definition Hogan used, but there's something like that. It just tells you what they bring to the table, and then you get to assess, is that a really good match for, one, the job, two, their relationships around the team, and three, in terms of bringing the best out of me as their leader. And sometimes, you may go for a different type of candidate because it's a better match in how they work with the team and how they help me become a better leader versus the core requirements of the job, particularly I think for executives. But Hogan would be one that I do recall that's there, but I tend not to promote any particular one. I think it's more the rigor of using psychometric tools with a good amount of understanding and using it, knowing what is the outcome that you want. Do I want someone to be great at this job? Actually, I want them to be additive to the team. Or I really want them to be way more challenging of me than what I get from elsewhere in the team.
Yeah. And one question here, how do you uncover blind spots in your board environments, particularly when seeking high performance?
I think it's as simple as saying or asking the question, what do we think our blind spots could be? Now, by their definition, you can't see a blind spot, but you can speculate around that. Or you can say things like, so for us as a board, what's predictable for us? Yeah, we're all, I don't know, alpha males, extroverted, thinkers who love risk and high challenge environments. Great. So what's predictable for us? We will go looking for risky, high challenging and opportunities for the company, which may not be the right thing to do. Or we will impose that mindset on management who may be operating from a different perspective. So I think something as simple as what's predictable for us, or as we go into this particular deal or conversation or opportunity, what could be the blind spots that we bring to this based on past experience. So a bit more speculative rather than a deterministic conversation.
Yeah, that's good. Excellent. All right. So I think we'll wrap up there. Appreciate your time. So I think what I've taken out of this is firstly, understand the context is a key one wherever you're coming into board or executive team, and then understanding what you need to displace. So what's the future you're looking for, and what's predictable, and what's the generated future you're looking for, and then how are you shifting that context? So that's one thing, and I think that making sense, so that listening, coming in, not assuming that you have all the right answers. So putting your assumptions down, but not sharing them, and probably putting a line through most of them as you go through. I like the idea of just getting rid of the adjectives, because I think many people, as you say, will say, how do we have a difficult conversation? There's so many courses, crucial conversation, whatever you want to call it, it's the same, that they mean the same, but actually I need to have a conversation, and I think that's a really nice way of talking about it, and actually being focused on the outcome. And I do agree that, you talk about the unsaid is never spoken but clearly communicated. So we know that body language, or what you're not saying, or people can read that. The other bits I took out was being 100% accountable for the situation, and coming in as a leader, whether you're the leader on the executive team or the chair, taking account of you have to be accountable for that situation. You may not have caused that situation, but you're there to shepherd the organization into the future. And then 3 questions, why are you here? What matters to you? And what's concerning you? So 3 simple questions I think you can ask in many situations, work and non-work, I think, as well. And I think that's we've heard it before around that, getting to know people. So whether it's understanding those questions, their values, getting to know them, and through socializing, I think all of that helps build an understanding of the person. And then that integrity word. So people bandy integrity around a lot, but don't actually define what it means. So it's good to have that, understanding of keeping your word, what you're saying you're going to do, being true to your values, and doing what's expected of you. So that's really some great insights, Mike. So I really appreciate your time. I'm just seeing if there's, since you've already written a fantastic book, would you mind sharing 2 to 3 books you'd recommend on becoming a successful executive leader, and why these particular books? It would be a great way to offer extra value for viewers.
Oh, extra value. So I'll have to look over my shoulder to see what I've got. There's a beautiful book written by Owen Eastwood called Belonging.
Yeah, I've read that.
Book that's pretty good. I found the book Playing to Win is a good book on strategy. And then whatever Michael Henderson has ever written, I've found really, really useful from a culture perspective. A lot of people say to me, what's the best leadership book you've ever read. I tend not to go to one. I've just found there's wisdom in a whole lot of different areas. So that's why I haven't recommended a leadership book. One thing I'd say about someone like Elon Musk, actually, and I know people have varying views on him, but one of the things I would admire about him is he actually reads from different disciplines and brings that into whatever it is that he's doing. That's why he's able to think about, let's go and build a tunnel boring machine while we can reuse a rocket. So I'd just use him as an example of that, where I think going to different disciplines or reading in different areas to inform your area can be really, really insightful. Because if you can translate, okay, in the realm of health and safety, that looks like that, and I've got a finance problem, well, you can actually translate those things across in terms of how you can close gaps.
Excellent, and I'd recommend the Owen Eastwood. I've got that on Audible, so I think he reads it as well. So, yeah. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike. If anyone wants to know more about Govn365, how it can help you uncover blind spots and risks to drive more value, then please feel free to contact me. We'll have this on our website in the next day or so, so you can share that with others. So thanks once again, Mike. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, cheers,
everyone.